um, the Men of Faith Summit and our final roundtable, which is the Christian roundtable. And so grateful to all of you for being with us, especially those folks who have been able to join us this morning for the last two roundtables. So we've had a really rich, I think, wonderful, some of the words, I'm sure in the evaluation, I probably have a lot of words, but it's just been really an amazing dialogue. I've heard a lot of really positive feedback from folks about the experience so far. And so I really appreciate kind of being part of this conversation, which in a lot of ways is not the only time that we've had this conversation, but it's an important kind of focus on preventing sexual violence with men of faith. And so I think it's really unique. And I've never seen anything like this happen anywhere here in Texas or around the country. Hilda talked about earlier a group of faith leaders that we brought together for a statewide gathering. But I think this has been really unique that we've been able to sort of explore these different faiths and talk about very specific strategies. And I'm glad that we've been able to have this conversation together. And so we hope to continue this afternoon with our discussion focused on the Christian faith. So we're going to sort of explore strategies and what folks are doing around the state around this particular issue. I do want to ask folks, if you're on social media, to please share on Twitter and Facebook the link to this particular roundtable. And so if you're on Twitter or Facebook, you can share it directly from Facebook or just retweet it from my handle. Just use the hashtag Men of Faith Texas, which is up here, and you can find the link for this roundtable. And so I want to encourage you to do that if you haven't already. So, and thank you to everyone who has been participating and sharing their thoughts and tweeting and posting messages and sharing pictures on Instagram. We want to encourage all of you to do that during this roundtable. So thank you so much for being part of this discussion. If we could go around and introduce ourselves, and once we've done that, we'll go through the group agreements, and we'll get started, and hopefully some other folks will join us when time to start the actual discussion of it. So,
I'm Wendy Holstenall. I work at TAASA. I am the training human trafficking specialist.
I'm Risha Isman. I'm with the Texas Council on Family Violence. I'm the prevention director.
I'm JJ. I'm a trainer for the National Latino Network, and we are a national organization that does, or we're one of the four cultural institutions that does training on domestic violence and sexual assault across the country. Our work specifically is around public policy, research, and training, culturally informed advocacy as well.
So my name is Jose Carrasco, and I'm the director of the Family Resource Center at Dobie Middle School. The Family Resource Center is from the Outside Voices. We have Family Resource Centers at Vernon, Dobie, that's where I'm at, Reagan, and LBJ. So Family Resource Center, basically, we deal with everything from basic needs to adult learning, and we get a lot of different situations, so that's how
Roy Rios with the Texas Council on Family Violence, back to take part in the Christian roundtable.
My name is Rachel Glendale-Strauss, and I am the member support and program advocacy director here at TAASA. Hi, I'm Donna Roy. I'm with Family Life Enterprise. I work with clients for self-defense and other areas that protect their home life.
My name is Colin Forthauer. I'm from the Sexual Assault Resource Center. I'm in charge of education and outreach.
Darren Dorsey from the Sexual Assault Resource Center as well, and also do education and outreach.
that round of introductions.
No, I'm Hilda Gutierrez. I'm with the Texas Council on Family Violence. I'm a prevention coordinator. And I'm probably going to be standing up because I'm pretty cool.
Do whatever you need to do. Just walk around.
This is what I'm thinking.
I am, my name is Tim Martin.
trying to get into the stream. So Tim will be today's moderator. So if the folks who are online, just to remember, we have like 5 years online. So I want to welcome you and ask you to introduce yourself. And so if you can please share your name and your organization you're with. We know that there are folks who are tuning in Gainesville, Texas, and some other folks around the state. So if you want to introduce yourself, in order to participate in the chat function, you have to sign up for Ustream, and so hopefully you've done that either with your email address or Facebook. And so please introduce yourself for us, and that way we know who's watching us online. So we have 6 viewers, which is even better. So again, please share during the meeting. Share if you can already, or if you haven't already. Share the link to this particular roundtable. And again, there will be a recording. So now Tim is in there. So he will be moderating, and we will try to, we will invite folks online who are participating from around the state to participate as much as possible in the chat room. So, yeah. Any questions about that? All right. Let's go ahead and get started. So the group agreements, I think we're all at this point pretty familiar with them. We have a couple new people, so we want to make sure that they are aware of them. So Donna and April weren't able to be with us, and Jose was online, so he heard some of this. But so it's kind of cool that Jose was online this morning and he was with us in person. But the group agreements are pretty basic. I want to encourage you to speak for yourself. I really want us to focus on our experiences, especially working with our Christian men and Christian faith leaders. And so really wanted to talk from that place. To listen for understanding, to really understand where folks are coming from, their level of experience. We're not going to engage in a debate or an argument. This is not intended to have a discussion about or a debate about Christianity, but rather really engage in fruitful conversation that includes questions and comments and sort of an exchange of resources and ideas. So I want to encourage everybody to do that. So as part of that, we are just going to agree to disagree, that there's not things that we're necessarily, all agree with about how to engage Christian men or how to engage Christian faith leaders. So I think there definitely is an opportunity for us to just engage in a respectful dialogue. That feeds into giving unconditional respect to yourself and to others. We want folks to just be respectful to one another, be respectful to the folks who are participating online, and please take care of yourself. That includes making sure you get tea or water or juice. If you have to answer the phone or if you have to leave for whatever reason, I want to encourage you to do that and take care of yourself. And if you need to go to the restroom, you don't have to wait till afterwards. You can go ahead and do that. And then what you need to be sensitive to others. I think want to ensure that folks feel like they're learning something, that they're taking something away from today's roundtable. And so I want to encourage all of you to think about whether you spoke a lot in the last roundtable, whether you didn't speak at all, and really want to encourage you to sort of share any insight that you have during this afternoon's roundtable. So those are group agreements. I think they're useful in terms of our conversation, and hopefully the folks online can introduce themselves as well.
Or we have Annette
All right.
Signs, who's with us this morning.
Online.
Participating online.
Wow, that's crazy. We have Jose who's online and now with us in person. You guys want to go ahead and introduce yourself? Is everybody already gone?
Sorry, yeah. It's okay.
So my name is Letty Manzano. I work in Houston at the Houston Area Women's Center, and I'm the manager of counseling and advocacy. I work mainly with survivors, but I've been involved in prevention for a very, very long time, so I still have an interest in it. And I do believe fighting for boys and men is the solution.
Hi, my name is Laura Zavala, and I am a counselor at the Houston Area Women's Center. I work primarily with our sexual services.
Okay, my name is Neulen Bajo Niebla. I'm also from the Houston Area Women's Center, and I'm the Sexual Services Coordinator.
Everybody here should have a table 10 so we can see who's in the room, for those folks that can get introduced. I did want to say I got a text from Kelly in Gainesville about how to submit a comment or question. So Kelly, this is for you. So if you can hear me, let Tim know. I want to make sure that the audio is working well. I think Annette would have told us if we were having any issues with audio. But in order to participate in the chat chat discussion, you have to sign up for Ustream. And so if you hit the say something, it will automatically ask you to sign up for Ustream, and you can sign up with Facebook or your email address. And so I encourage you to sign up with your email address. It was easy for Tim to join. And so we want to make sure that Kelly is able to participate. She's doing this with her pastor there in Gainesville. I don't know if other pastors have joined her, but that's exciting to have them. So hopefully they'll be able to get signed in. Thank goodness for texting. Otherwise, I wouldn't have known. So, okay, great. So hopefully Kelly will be able to join us in a few minutes, and they'll be able to introduce themselves and let us know who's there. And then, unfortunately, the reality of the group, we are actually expecting a number of pastors in person. They haven't arrived yet, so some of them we're traveling from San Antonio, so let's see if they join us. But Kelly's on, she's there with her pastor, Jerry Jones, and he's a fantastic, he's a really great, I hope he's hearing this. I had an opportunity to visit with him when I was in Gainesville for a workshop that they did around engaging them in events that I was able to be a part of. And so his church hosted the event, and he spoke really well to this issue. So I hope they're counting on that. Any questions or comments about it? If you got any questions or sharing on Facebook or Twitter, Instagram, always hard after lunch. I'm glad you came back. And we're happy to have the new folks, and we hope that you enjoy this discussion. So we will keep an open mind and an open heart for this one, and hopefully other folks will join us. So I think it is really useful, and one of the things that I noticed about the last two discussions is that I didn't ask people specifically whether they identified with that particular faith, right? Because I think this morning Saeed assumed, and I think the rabbi assumed maybe that they were the only people of that particular faith in the meeting. And so I want you to think about that for this particular discussion, and think about your own experiences if this is a faith that you share, which we know is the dominant faith, not just here in Texas, but in the United States. And what your own personal experience has been, if you're a member of a Christian community, but also what your experience has been like engaging those particular communities. And so I wanted you to kind of think about that. I think it would be really helpful for our discussion. And it's not something we generally talk about when we have prevention gatherings in terms of what our own experiences have been like. And so we don't necessarily have a pastor here in person that we can call on and ask questions unless Kelly is able to join us online. So, this is our first discussion question. In your opinion, why is it important to engage Christian boys and men in sexual violence prevention? And so I want you to sort of think about, and I think we've talked a lot about, but I'm really curious to hear from the new folks in the room, why you decided to come to this particular roundtable, and why you think it's sort of important that that we focus on Christian boys and men around sexual violence prevention. Just to get us started.
I'll go first. There's a lot of them and they hold a lot of power. So if you don't engage them, you're missing a lot.
I also think it goes back to what we said this morning about we're all part of the community. We all live in towns together. And if we want our towns to be safe, then we have to clue everybody in onto what that means, and what it means for them. So, and I don't disagree with you.
I also think it's important because growing up, I grew up with Emiliano in a faith-based, faith-based organization would pick us up and take us to different trips. It was nonprofit. And because, religion and schools are so separate now, I feel like, the church is, it's difficult to get into that environment again of where it's okay to be a mentor if you're Christian. It's okay to volunteer at a school if you are Christian. Like, it's okay if you believe, we're really trying to get mentors and volunteers and church groups to come to the Family Resource Center where I work at Early Middle School and be mentors and be a part of kids' lives. And it's okay if you're a church, as long as you're not trying to make people go to your church, But that's like anything, like, it doesn't matter if you're a Republican or Democrat, as long as you're not trying to get kids to, so it's very interesting growing up in that faith-based and having a mentor from that faith-based community, because I think it helped me a lot, I mean, and it wasn't just that mentor at that location of a faith-based nonprofit, but it was other mentors along the way. But one of the mentors was at a faith-based organization, and, we prayed and, all that stuff, and I think it helped me grow up understanding what's right and what's wrong. So I think it's very important to have this conversation with Christian leaders, young men that are in college, that are role models. And it's okay to come back and have discussions with people about how you dealt with situations. Because the only way you're going to learn is through other people's experiences. So that's why I'm here today.
I just got off the phone with Kelly. I was talking to her, walking you through the process, so hopefully they'll be able to join us. Counting on counting on Ted.
Seven viewers just joined.
Yeah, there's a lot of people online, but they haven't introduced themselves. So I think people are struggling. Like if you don't follow that process, then it's difficult for you to participate in the discussion. We know there's some folks online, some pastors who are planning on joining us online, so I hope that they will introduce themselves. But hopefully Kelly had a day to help Kelly and beyond. Any other folks?
I think the other thing is also that, Christian religion is also very multifaceted, and every Christian community, whether it's Catholic, Baptist, Mormon, I guess Mormons are Christian, what have you, it's prescribed kind of the universal message, but it's also very different, interpreted very differently. And there's also, in my very humble opinion, there's also a disjointed conversation as well around that. So that, that in itself may cause some kind of differences around opinion or what have you. So it's not, it's kind of this, there's Baptists, there's Catholics, there's more amendments. There's, we're very specific about our religious affiliation every time we introduce ourselves, I think, in any space. So I think that also may influence how that messaging around gender-based violence or ending sexual-based violence or what have you may be influenced by that conversation. So, yeah.
Let's give Ted a round of applause. You too, JJ. You do. But I'm really happy to see that Kelly was able to get on with that. So, welcome her. So, welcome them. And hopefully they'll be able to introduce themselves. Really done, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm not.
Heard some good things that I really agree with. I mean, everybody's really hit the nail on the head. Christianity has a lot of power. The men and boys who grow up in this faith really grow up having a lot of confidence in their abilities, hopefully, and really can influence the world in good or bad ways. And the conversations can be very disjointed around, how do you approach this issue. So I'm excited to see what happens today and the conversations that occur. But nevertheless, it's important because young boys and men have an impact on the lives of women and girls, and specifically Christian boys and men can have a really huge impact on the lives of girls and women, and need to really understand this issue. And by us engaging them to help them understand how to develop conversations and understanding around these different topics is essential.
One thing that parallels with church and the attendance is the least likely people to attend church are males between the age of in their young 20s. And if it's approached in a very young age, because of the concern of prevention and rape and issues like that, they're least likely to attend church after they're in their 20s. So it's very important to address it when they're young, in their youth. So having these would actually help attendance later on, when they reach in their 20s and actually engage them to attend church more, because you're actually dealing with issues that they have more or are more prone to when they reach that age. So it's very important. And overall, I think it would be a great thing if other churches discuss it, even in these modern times of all the issues and the new concerns that they have. It is my church.
A couple of folks who joined us. We have John Canales Brzezinski with Texas Catholics for Inclusion, and then Kelly is on. She mentioned that in a very rural county where she works with, it's challenging to get people to come to something that isn't held in their own church. That's one in response to this question.
Well, welcome to John, too. I'm glad that John could join us from Houston. He wanted to be with us in person, but I'm glad to see that he's able to join us online. Yeah.
One of the things that I think about when I hear the word Christian men and children and boys, I think that also gives an added level of power, and when I think from my perspective as a counselor, like I think about sometimes when I'm going to assume that people when they are coming from their base perspective, that someone is following a religion, they believe they want to be held up to the high standard of knowledge of that religion. So sometimes the myths can be very mixed, all of the cultural beliefs and everything. So reaching out to them, I think, from these kind of these animals, I think it can also help them, understand also the religious beliefs, in a more progressive way. Let's say, we don't have to come from. This is not two different topics. This is just the same topic, and violence shouldn't exist from your own perspective. But when I deal with a victim of domestic violence, for example, like I should not leave my husband, you know, like I should endure, like take my cross and just deal with this for the rest of my life. And so I think maybe also the man believes that it's my role as the head of the household to make the decisions, to be in control, to do this. And I feel like that's because this is the same place that I grew up with. So I think that also is trying to redefine this concept of putting them in another perspective. I think it's also important.
I mean, you have really, and then we see it, like when dad is like that and it's real dominant, the child acts different at school, like with the woman teacher or the male teacher. Like he will respect the male teacher, but to the other teacher, I mean, there's no respect. I mean, curse her out and stuff. So definitely we're seeing the trend of what happens at home. We can see it at school, and it's and it could be culture. You're right. It could be the way that's the way things are at the house or something. But how to have that conversation with that young man and tell him what your dad is doing is wrong. That's a very tough. That's very tough because that's the way it's always been taught. So I think that's a very open conversation. I think people should have that conversation, especially at church, where I think it's a safe ground, But I mean, we do see male students that are very disrespectful just to the women teachers, but to the male teachers, they're very respectful to. And I think that comes back to that situation at home with
I want to say something about churches being safe places. Back in the day when I was doing outreach, I went into a lot of churches and talked to a lot of women's groups. And I asked them what they wanted training on, and a lot of it came up saying around resources for domestic violence, medical, sexual assault, blah, blah, blah. I said, can we hold it in the church? And they said, absolutely not. This is not a safe place to have that discussion. We will be labeled, we will be shunned, and everybody will know that our husband is this, that, or the other. So it may have changed in 20 years, 25 years, but I want us to be aware that in some religions, that's not okay. I do a lot of outreach and training around human trafficking. And I have been told by a lot of church groups that want to open up safe houses for victims that I am just not Christian enough to understand the problem. So what I'm seeing is a lot of times an us versus them. And so that's just my personal experience. I wonder where that's coming from, because the conversation should include, and I'm a big proponent of this, I think it should include men and women and boys and girls all sitting and hearing the same information in a very basic level before we break up into discussions or go off in the way, because it's just like when my kids came home and said, Mom, help me do the new math when they were doing their homework, I had no clue what they were talking about. And that I'm using it as an analogy to create distance, or us versus them, and that's not what, to me, prevention is about. It's all of us together in this great big pot. I agree churches should be safe places, but that's not been my total experience.
And if church is not a safe place.
Don't worry.
School, we can't really talk about. I mean, we can only go so far, because then we'll get stopped as well.
Right.
So then what is a good location? So, and those are the two churches and schools. That's where most people go to, Luckily, when I was growing up, it was a youth group. So you talk with peers about issues. And I found it safe just because, to be honest with you, everybody had the same issues at that same youth group. So if I brought up something, that person had probably been through the same thing, and they were just kind of we were just trying to help each other out, basically. But I do understand where there could be a hesitation, because I do see it in schools too, when it comes to, sexual violence and stuff, and even sex. I mean, there's a very thin line that you can talk, and not talk about.
Right.
So, but just like you're saying, there has to be a conversation. I mean, where it's held, hopefully it's not a parking lot conversation, but if it has to be in the parking lot of that church, then it's going to be in the parking lot. But somebody's learning somewhere about sexual violence, and some of the students that we're seeing, they're learning them, from their parents, from the house, from the home, and they come to school, and it's not about math, English, literature. It's about, I gotta go back to this household, How do you want me to take this test? That's not even what I'm thinking about. So I think it's finding where that family is safe.
Right.
I think you're right.
It's safe.
I was just going to say, either Kelly or the pastor, I think they're both on there, mentioned that, like in their town, kind of echoing what JJ was talking about, like, that Christianity is not monolithic, that the churches are actually kind of divided, like, are we going to this church or that church? And so they started meeting at like a local restaurant, trying to get away from that. To deal with that issue.
I just talked to a person today, and I'm going to go to the church in Taylor, Texas. They have a Christian biker church, and they're starting the concept of house churches, where it's not structured. So I'm going to go visit their church Sunday. And they believe that the church should be, so they just go around to different people's, to the same members' houses, and that's where they park their bikes and they have mass. So, I thought that was interesting. The word church, what is the real definition? Like, where is the church? So, I think because they're meeting at a restaurant, I think that could be considered church. To be honest with you, they're talking about good local things. I think finding that safe location for the family, I think that's a big key. I hadn't really thought about that.
Over lunch, my friends and I were talking about just our different experiences in church. Like I said earlier, I grew up Catholic. I don't practice any faith right now, but that was my experience. And I grew up in a really progressive Catholic church. It was a church that was the order of the Jesuit priests, so that's the order that the Pope is from now. And Nolan shared that she had, also, progressive, or interactions with progressive Catholic Christians at her church. And so I just want to clarify that there are safe churches. Sometimes we talk about this, and that there are safe schools, because in my experience as a prevention worker, which is what I used to do in the past, St. Agnes, which is a Catholic school in Houston, was the most open to us. Very, very open, and they taught this stuff in their curriculum, and they had one of the survivors that we worked with, a young woman who was sexually assaulted. She came to counseling at our center and then did a speak out with the whole student body. And it became part of their culture. So I do think that it's possible to find those allies out there in the Christian community, just as in our previous conversations, for those of you who have been here or been with us online, in the Jewish community and in the Islamic community.
Is there any way that any of the churches can agree or some kind of arrangement with TAASA that you educated them in the program here, and that they actually, like y'all recommend each other? And like, okay, here's some extra support. This church over here is one of the ones that do our programs, and they believe and they understand that your family needs help, and you need to come in this church offering additional connections to them.
I think rape crisis centers are sort of in a unique position to partner with local churches and institutions. I think now we absolutely have a role in working with those larger networks, those dioceses, like those institutions that are part of a larger Christian network of churches or a Muslim or a Jewish synagogue. So I think this in some ways is a way for us to invite Christian leaders to that conversation. I think one of the things we talked about this morning was inviting Christian men to be a part of the Capital Day, which supports both the council and our legislative agenda. So to be able to have a strong showing of men who identify or who are part of a Christian community show up and be a part of that effort to ask for continued funding for our services or to ask for legislation. I think that's sort of an example of what something that all men of faith can do, especially faith leaders and encouraging men in their communities to be a part of these efforts. But I honestly think our role is to sort of facilitate that, encourage them to partner with a local rape crisis center. Now, there's not a rape crisis center in every community here in the state. It's sort of the unfortunate reality. But in those communities, I think, like was said, people generally go to those communities first. They go to their faith leader first. And I think we absolutely need to train faith leaders around these issues, around how to work with, and to understand the dynamics of abusive relationships and sexual violence and sexual harassment and sexual abuse. And I don't think it's something we have done that we can do better. And I think in terms of training and partnering with them. But I think that's really the role of local rape crisis centers. And our role is to support the rape crisis centers in that effort as a coalition. And that's why I think we wanted to have this particular conversation, because we know that there is such a diverse Christian community and that they have a profound, I think it's been said before, that they have such a profound role in their community. And they are the dominant faith in Texas. And the reality is that it is the dominant faith, Christians in Texas. And so I think we do sort of have, there's an opportunity for us to really develop those partnerships. One of the things I've been thinking about during the day is that as members of faith communities, we sort of have an obligation, not an obligation, there's an opportunity, I think, for us to go to our pastor, just like Kelly did, invited her personal pastor to be a part of this event, or to invite other pastors in the community to be a part of this event. I think that's going to be much more effective than Emiliano making cold calls and sending emails. And you know what I mean? I think if we sort of say we're part of this faith community and I want you to be a part of this effort because I know you share my values, you understand the work that I do as a member of your congregation, then I think we're more likely to get those faith leaders sort of at the table to help us with this work. So I know it's not necessarily a response to the question, but that's sort of how we thought about our role here, sort of facilitating this discussion between faith leaders and prevention educators, mental health folks that are in the community. Any other questions? Any other comments to this specific question?
So I just wanted to say about there's not a crisis center, rape crisis center everywhere, but there are churches and congregations everywhere. So to start doing grassroots, you have to go there. That's the first place that you go.
Any comments from? So I want to sort of, we've been focusing on these very specific questions on these different faiths, but I'm curious to hear from folks, what has been the role of faith leaders from your experience? Have you partnered with them? What has been successful about those partnerships? I know it's not part of it's another question, but I'm curious if folks want to sort of share what their experience has been like, because whether it's been positive or negative. I think it's valid to hear both, but I think folks have experiences of partnering with a faith leader that really gets it. Like I said, Kelly's pastor really gets it. The fact that his church hosted this event that was specifically around engaging men to sort of take a stand against violence against women was really profound for me. And it was one of the few opportunities where I've actually encountered a pastor who's publicly speaking out and supporting that particular type of effort. So I wonder if other folks have those kinds of experiences.
It just dawned on me today, or right now, that we automatically assume that a faith leader is someone who's like the pastor or the reverend or the bishop or whatever. There's a lot of lay faith leaders in our community. My parents, for example, identify with the Catholic Church. Both my parents are very strong faith leaders in their community. They're involved in all these various ministries. So I think we need to also have had a conversation of what does a faith leader make and how do they influence their faith community. Because it's not always the pastor or the reverend. And in the previous discussion with the rabbi, he said, that rabbi will move if the flock move him. And growing up, listening to my parents, going to church every Sunday, like the good Catholic family that we are, and there's, in the Catholic Church, priests are cycled to different communities every decade or so, based on their strength or whatever, and they're moved to communities where there may be a deficiency and their particular skill will elevate that community. And so there's been, of course, my home church back in Brownsville, there's been a lot of changes in priests, and every priest has a different demeanor. And with the new incoming priest, there's a wane in the flock or the congregants, and then depending on the priest's behavior characteristic. And my parents have said, no priest is going to kick me out of my church. I am the church. I don't care. And so there's this thing about who are faith leaders, who really influences the leadership, the establishment of the faith community, whatever that is. So I think we really have to talk to those folks that do have those relationships with those institutions or those religious organizations. Because I have to, speaking from personal experience, my father is very vocal. He has no problem going into the bishop's office. But of course, it's been years of community work and activism and leadership. And so he's not afraid because he knows that he is the church, not the bishop, not the appointed priest. And so he capitalizes on that. And every time there was an issue, my dad would call me directly and say, hey, mijo, I have this lady, she came to church, she needs a number to the local crisis center, or can you talk to her? So those are the folks that are going to talk to us. And they're the folks that are going to talk on behalf of us to their leadership, their established leadership, or official leadership in their churches or community.
And I agree with that. That's the promotora model that we, always wonder, why don't we use it more to get the message out, because it's done so well in terms of health benefits or health risks. And this is when we're talking sexual violence, domestic violence. This is a health risk. This is education. So how can we be more proactive maybe in looking at it as from different eyes aside from the leadership, who has the informal power, maybe you could call that, in the churches?
We were talking about preventing violence and earlier, but like the social norms and the culture that leads to that violence, and those are the leaders that, like you said, some of the more formal leadership are in and out sometimes. 10 years is so long, but they're less like a picture there. And so if you really are looking at long-term change, the way that people think about how they interact with one another, what violence is, expectations around folks' behavior based on any number of things, including gender, that those are the folks that can really challenge that and put something different can help you out there in kind of a long-term way, which is we're probably on.
I was gonna say, I think when I think about my experience in church and getting my husband involved, it started like in a fellowship of like people, like more of a social event. And so as y'all are talking, I'm thinking about like how you balance like people that we've gravitated towards that are our leaders but aren't necessarily like the official leaders. But then you kind of need that gap, like between like a place where you know that your religion and your faith like feels like the prevention and the structure, that those are values set in whatever doctrine you're teaching or how you choose to interpret, the text of the Bible. Like, but that message has to kind of exist within the church and church leaders, as well as the people in doing fellowship and the community members, like asking for that. So like I see, like my husband probably goes to church just because those are his friends and those are people that he identifies with and they're socially active. But then I think like what would it take to start to have those conversations as men, not like as a woman encouraging them to talk about their roles as men, as how they would talk about like how do I choose to raise my child differently and what that space looks like, but also at the same time like those church leaders and those official people saying like as men you should think about these things. So where does that like intersection exist? Does TAASA attend different, go to the churches like he does and go and speak to different frontiers of the church?
I think TCFD for a while had on her primary prevention when I was there. But the other one did.
Yeah, but she wasn't attending the churches. She was like you were describing, Vivi. She was trying to find people within various institutions that had the ability to create conversations around intimate partner violence. So she did some work in the Austin area and also in the Houston area with Concepcion.
Yeah. So one of the examples that I had for, the positive examples that we've had is that one of our prevention educators, and she's been doing it a very long time, is she would, somehow, she got the issues of sexual and domestic violence instituted into the curriculum at the College of Biblical Studies. So every student who was going to that college had to take a course on our issues, if you will, or the issues that we're passionate about. I was lucky enough to have presented part of it, and so it's not just the pastors, but it was men and women who went to these colleges for whatever reason, theologically studies or otherwise, who also were then able to spread the word, if you will. One of the negative examples that I had of going out into the community was doing talk with teenagers about sexual violence, and one of the things that we talk a lot about, and you mentioned the words, like we can say no means no for a long time, but we also need to know when yes means yes. And so we talk about consent and what is consent. And so we had like this dynamic conversation about it. And it was a large group of kids at a Catholic church. And we were invited there by the parents and so on and so forth. And everybody seemed to be having a good time. And then at the end, a priest came up and said, I'm sorry, but I just want to tell you that you cannot talk about consent here. Like in front of everybody, like not after it was over. And pretty much had me sit down next to him and talked about how that as Christians, they were not allowed to consent until they were married. And I mean, it was just really difficult to be in that situation. We've also had a situation where McKibben, who did prevention work with us out in the community, a man doing this type of work got called by St. Thomas University to go and talk about sexual assault prevention to the people who were in charge of the dorms there, but he could not talk about consent, which was really interesting to us. So we've had, good and bad. One of the other really positive experiences is having Pamela Ellis, who's been with our agency for a very long time. She's very active in her church. She's probably a leader there. She goes to Lily Grove Baptist Church, and she really got their new pastor years ago on board with our mission, and he started preaching about these issues for the whole month of October, and like every Sunday in October, you were going to hear about domestic violence, and every Sunday in April, you were going to hear about sexual assault. And so they created a support group there, they created a prevention group there, it was like, and in that African American community, it was amazing.
So there are those examples. I think that's where, to your question, Donna, I think that's where the work that we are trying to, again, facilitate, maybe not facilitate, but to foster and to support. As a coalition is really to support folks, especially prevention folks. I think this is an interesting conversation, right? We don't have this conversation all the time about because it intersects with our own personal beliefs, right? This is like, it's interesting to be in a space where if you identify as a Christian, you're not talking about Christianity and prevention work, and like, when do you ever get to talk about those two things together? So, I think that's sort of our role, is to facilitate these types of conversations, but and to support prevention folks that want to do this type of work, because it is so new. And not new in the sense of like we're just beginning to work with churches, but I think we're talking about sexual violence and just raising awareness about sexual violence or sexual abuse or sexual harassment, but we're actually trying to get to some of the root causes of sexual violence. And it's a very different message than folks have usually, hear about sexual violence. So I think that's the exciting part of this work, is that the reason that we're having this event, the reason that the advisory committee gravitated towards this issue was because we felt like there's so much potential in it, I think, to engaging large groups of people, and specifically men, in faith communities. So, I don't know, Rory, if you have any other insights from that conversation, like like why this sort of came to the top. It's always, I've been reflecting over the last year how we were here a year ago, exactly this week. And that this is what came out of that conversation. I boggled in my mind. I don't know if it was just a group of people or what happened. But.
I think we were just trying to think about what's an area of our work that we're really not tapped into that well, and what is a group that we can really tap into that would have a huge impact. And it really hit us kind of like a ton of bricks in a way, in a good way. And it was in the realm of faith and wanting to understand different faiths and connect with those faiths so that we can get some dialogue from them, to learn from them. How can we learn from you so that we can reach your people better and largely reach more men and boys? And so it's really exciting to see that today here we sit, and I think some incredible dialogue has been shared. No one is sharing too many thoughts or remarks, if you're and so,
So glad for the higher advisory. Thank you.
And people in their, people in their communities are really rooted to their church. Like, growing up in East Austin, you have your church you go to, that's where your parents go and you go, and you're so rooted into that community that you're right, it is a good community to kind of tap into these type of issues. But now that I work with the district, some of those rooted communities are not rooted anymore because they've been moved out of those communities where there is a church, a Catholic church, let's say, every 5 blocks. Well, then all these people move out and they come to Rumber, they come to Bell Valley, and I'm calling churches, but I call them move for donations and clothing and stuff like that for a family. I wish I would be able to call somebody and say, hey, can you teach class about this or that? Because I know that that trust is there coming up and telling me something for some reason, I don't know if I was just raised like that. I mean, I'm gonna listen, I'm gonna listen. But yeah, they're very rooted communities. The ones that have those faith-based organizations, they're very rooted. It almost feels like, they take care of their community. I don't know how to explain it, but I've been working at these other communities where there's not a faith-based place, and it's very unrooted. They don't know really where to go, so they seek help from different places. And I think it's an interesting conversation to talk about that. Like those churches, how do they extend out to talk about different things if the population is moving out? You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't know, especially here in Austin, East Austin, there's like 5 or 6 churches. I'm wondering who's going to those churches. Everybody left it. Everybody left the neighborhood. So how do we get back to that faith-rooted community where we can bring in subjects that are kind of tougher to a person that has that, like I was talking about, when you see a priest, and it's like respect when you go to places. Because growing up, when I was growing up, you saw the priest and I almost wanted to be one. Like, man. So, I don't know, it's just, I guess finding leadership, and I've worked with a lot of great pastors and deacons, but really, we've never touched on an issue, and I think that's something that I'm going to work on, where there has to be more than the church can do than helping me with clothing and with food pantries. I believe that because I grew up in something way different. I grew up where I went to this organization and they talked to me about all different types of issues. I basically grew up there, There was no, I learned, I don't know if it was all good, but I learned some stuff when I grew up. It was a good place to be at.
Okay. I'm not sure, this might come out a little jumbled, but a couple of things when Letty was talking about how the consent issue kind of triggers a kind of backlash, and going along with this theme that I've been thinking about throughout this day about language and about how as prevention workers we have like a set language that we use when we talk to populations, and we talked about, meeting people where they are and understanding when we talk to the rabbi or we talk to the gentleman from the Islamic faith. We talked about understanding the faith and kind of thinking about language based on what they understand and how they kind of understand based on their faith. And it seems like almost like, I'll speak for myself, you have less patience for the Christian faith because it's so prominent. We all think we already know the language, and so there's almost like we don't recognize that we don't necessarily speak the same language. And if consent is a word that triggers a backlash, maybe we need to rethink the way we talk about the topic so that it's not triggering a backlash. I don't know. But that's something that I just thought about. Maybe the consent word isn't the right word to use. Not that obviously the issue of consent is important, but maybe the word is triggering something that we can probably work on as prevention workers to reach out to the faith communities. Maybe we can find a common ground that way. But I think it's so interesting because it's the Christian faith. We have less patience for that miscommunication or that lack of language connection. That might have come out really confused.
I think that's a great point. I mean, we at our conferences are always talking about cultural competency. It's like we need to have it when we're working with our victims.
No, I agree with you. I don't feel like I have to be so politically correct because I'm Catholic, and so I can really talk about how, like, the things that I don't like, and I appreciate that. I think that's really important. Also, was thinking about, was saying about who the members, like when there's an empowered member of that community, it's okay for them to confront the establishment. Like they are okay with saying, no, this is not the way that actual things are. That's why I guess for me growing up with progressive Chris, I enjoy it because they weren't being repressive and they weren't telling me not do that, don't do that. It was more about, like, rethinking how our faith is and just bringing it to the whole, love and respect. And I love that. I enjoy that and help me grow in that and just really enjoy it. So I feel like the more that we can engage people that are at that point, that can benefit a lot of our survivors because they are definitely disempowered sometimes in that area because either if they experience spiritual abuse through their partner or through their community because you have to stay or things like that, those can be role models to follow. It's okay to say, wait a minute, let's rethink this concept and let's see how it actually could apply to us.
Sometimes the stalkers or the predators who are actually committing the crime and everything may have, most likely, experienced some type of religion in their lifetime. So, had this information been given to them during a church event, during that religious part of their life, that they were more committed at that time, or more accessible to going to church at that time, somewhere in their life, maybe having this information would have been flying down the line. So it does, just because you're a Christian doesn't mean you're not guilty. There are more criminals within America with the whole picture, and they can actually have experienced some kind of religion in their life.
And you bring up an interesting point, something that reminded me of. I have to run here because it's something that has been really profound, upsetting, I think, for me personally. And it just involved some of my work with male survivors. Is that some of the sexual violence that they're experiencing is at the hands of faith leaders. So it's not, like when we're talking about preventing sexual violence, we've seen the media reports, we've seen the stories, we've encountered survivors who have experienced sexual violence at the hands of faith leaders or part of, there's a whole organization that works with survivors who were abused by priests. And these stories, I think that's sort of the encountering and sort of hearing those stories and working with those survivors, I think, has been difficult. And I don't think that we talk about the men who are part of those faith communities as the men that we're trying to target, but I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done at ensuring that faith leaders aren't abusing their members, and, boys and men in particular. It's not just boys and men who are experiencing that abuse, but generally it's at the hands of faith leaders who are men in the context of the Christian community. Now, there's no, I think it's just that conversation has to be had as well. It's not just holding those individuals accountable, but ensuring that as part of, like you were saying earlier, faith leaders, their own development, that we're working with them intensely so that they're also we're potentially preventing their own abusive behavior. In their own relationships. And I think even within the context of their own ministry as well. And I think that's, a place that we sort of have to, at least for me, I feel like it's a place where I also want to have that conversation about how do we ensure that faith leaders aren't abusing people. And it's not something that we talk about in the other roundtables, but it's something as a person, like as a person like me who grew up as part of the Christian faith, I think it's one of the things that we really difficult, very painful to talk about. but I just wanted to put that on the table. That's also, I think, community is a place that I really, it's not just Christian guys, like the guys who are lay leaders, like uh, JJ was talking about, that the faith leaders themselves in this community. I want to start with those guys and ensure that it's safe for people.
Wouldn't also, I mean, to me, the flip side of that question is making the whole community empowered so that if they see something, they can speak out about it. We see this happening, we hear the kids talking, we are concerned, whatever it is. So if there is someone who is a faith leader in that community, the community then is holding that faith leader accountable. The same way a faith leader on the flip side can give that information, can talk about that. Can we help prevent it? Yeah.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons I think I've been thinking about it, is that there's been a lack of accountability. And now there aren't those faith leaders in the room sort of to defend the responses of the churches to these issues. But I think there also hasn't been sort of a partnership, like they're not contacting us and trying to figure out what they can do. Like I haven't, I'm not getting that phone call from the bishop and saying, this is happening in our church. How can we address this issue internally? So I think there are definitely movements towards a more, like, where they're sort of trying to, or needing to hold people accountable. But I think that's sort of a place that we also have to work. I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, there's some great leaders, in the Christian faith, but for some reason, priests or whatever, they get this stigma because of one thing, which is sad, but I think that's why the conversation has to be started within the church, because if you do want faith leaders to talk about stuff like that, you kind of have to remove that as well, and it might help that. If they have this type of stuff, it might help that stigma kind of disappear, because it needs to. We need to trust our leaders, And it would be great if that were to happen, because it definitely will prevent, or at least make people aware. So there's a lot of great leaders out there that are in all these churches, and it's sad that like I was in the military, and when a Marine did something, it wasn't so and so did something. A Marine did this, It becomes like a whole body of people, and that's what happens to those kind of leaders, and that's sad because there's some really good leaders that can do some great work, But I think they're also kind of, I don't know if they want to talk about this kind of stuff because of that backlash, I don't know, So.
Is there a way that there can be different ways to set up per topic to each type of religion, or each, not the same, one won't fit all of them? Is there a way to possibly set up one for each band, for each church, or at least we can offer even my own church that and proceed that way? Or, I saw you raise your hand, sorry. So is there a way that, is that the ultimate goal from 1 year from now, to actually be, okay, 1 year we can achieve these topics and direct it and handle for each church that way? And
It's a good question, though. I think it really, the challenge, I think, for all of us is to figure out how, and I encourage everybody to think about that right now in terms of what are your next steps? In terms of how do you take this conversation forward, whether it's with your own pastor, or whether it's with, a priest or a reverend or, somebody who's studying in seminary. Like, how do you, I think that for me, that's the important question. I think, now, absolutely, this is the beginning. I don't think that we're necessarily, the intent of this roundtable is not to come out with solutions, and to say that this is, but to sort of begin a conversation that we hope will carry on. You know, I don't know that I've sort of, you know, I think we do have a role, and that's the reason that TAASA and the advisory committee sort of brought, you know, organized the summit. But we don't, I think rape crisis centers, again, have that capacity. Like, one of the things I think we want to do is empower them to have these conversations with the faith leaders in their local community. And I think they're going to be much more successful at that than us as a state coalition trying to, because even just TAASA reaching out to faith leaders, if you notice, they're not physically in the room. I think we don't have the same relationships that local people, that you as a member of a particular church have. That's going to be much more effective at getting those people to the table than we have. We absolutely have some authority, and people look to us as an expert around this particular issue. But I think you have the relationship that we do not have. That I don't have with faith leaders, Christian faith leaders here. And so I think that's one of the real challenges for us, is to identify those individuals on that spectrum of leadership and build relationships with them and invite them. Not all like, we need you to do X, Y, and Z today, but really how do we work with them long term to begin to incorporate some of these into their own practices, into their faith education, into their activities of their faith community. Like, I think that is that's going to be much more effective than TAASA bringing all the religious leaders, all the Christian faith leaders together for this one-time conference, and then magically they're all going to go back and we're going to have sexual violence, and that's just not going to happen. What will happen, what needs to happen, I mean, what I think can happen is the hard work has to happen, you know, again in communities with folks for a long time. You know what I mean? I think it took us 30 years to just have this summit as an organization. So to be able to have these conversations, it's taken us a long time to get to a place where we can just have this summit. So, you know, it's going to take us a long time to begin to feel like they are genuine allies, and because we have individuals. I mean, all of us, I think, can provide a handful of examples. But I think, and that's important. I think that's huge. But I think hopefully in 20, 30 years, we're going to have a different conversation. They're going to be asking, they're going to be sort of leading those efforts. We can just go and watch Netflix. And the churches will be much more active, and the rates of sexual violence will come down. You know what I mean? It's not just that institution, it's not just the communities of faith, but every institution, like the military and all the other institutions in our state, that will really have a much more active role and will be doing the work for us, in that sense.
And I think part of it also is that a lot of communities of faith are doing gender-based violence work, except they're looking at from immigration reform, human trafficking, poverty issues. And so I think our role is to help them make those connections that you are doing gender-based violence work. You are working towards ending violence in all its aspects. Because you work with immigrant communities, you're actually addressing the end of violence based on law, whatever. And so I think one of the conversations that needs to happen is that we need to help, and like you said, Wendy, and people have said, translation of words, right? And so I think for us, it's like, but you're already doing this kind of work. You're working with immigrant communities. Actually, you're working to end violence. And this is how you're doing it. and we introduce them slowly to our language. You know, you say you're doing this, actually this is how this language in your community translates in our community. So I think when we make those connections, it kind of makes the work less daunting because, you know, and I have conversations with my father that, Dad, you are doing gender-based violence work. You work within communities. You work to help people get to shelter, whether it's homelessness or finding employment or, you know, getting access to Medicaid or Medicare, all these things. And so the churches are doing the work. It's just that they're, and conversely, we're not acknowledging that they are doing the work because it's not in our language and the way we're used to doing advocacy and crisis intervention and prevention. So to flip the script, you know, how many of the centers, rape crisis centers in the state of Texas are willing to do the work to go and understand that they are, the faith communities are doing the work. And the thing is that a lot of people who work at the crisis centers, they're part of that community and they may not see a need for change either. They may not see a need for change because, hey, you know, we all go to the Baptist church, but we're all white, but where are the black folks? Where are the brown folks? I'm like, no, I wouldn't go to your church because I wouldn't feel comfortable as a brown man. You know? So beyond just gender-based violence is also the whole issue of, like you said, churches are home base for a lot of people, but also for a lot of people of color communities. You know, and if you're living in rural Texas, you know, some of these faith-based communities are very frightening for me because as a Latino man of Mexican descent, I'm very scared. When you have all these churches called cowboy churches, and then I also see a lot of Aryan nation flags being flown in a lot of people's front yards. And that's not to say that those folks are necessarily representative of the entire community, but those types of perceptions around faith and whatever are prevalent, whether you think you're embracing them or not. And if that faith community is embracing a lot of doctrine that is very racist and homophobic and all of these things, and like, shoot, if you're a survivor, if you're a woman being assaulted by your partner or was assaulted by whatever, you're not technically speak, right? So, I mean, so that's the challenge. Like, are the centers and the people that work in these centers that are part of those communities willing to make the change? You know, it's like, it's not just only on the faith community. It's like, are you willing to step out of that comfort zone and realize that there is a problem? Acknowledge why people aren't coming to us is because there is a problem as far as accessing us. So, I mean, that's really at the core of the conversation for me.
We're talking very much on the same thing. And the folks that I've talked to, one of their first, who've tried to reach out to the churches and haven't had success, often their first thing is like, well, I called and asked them to do this. And so it's that, like, it's still that, like, right, you know, we want to tell you what you should be talking to your folks about, and then we'll go back over here to doing what we do, and you carry this on rather than actually be partnership and know one another. And instead of developing a curriculum that we send to you, let's develop some language together that makes sense with us. So I'm just kind of echoing a lot, but I think it's that relationship building piece that is where a lot of these efforts fail. And it's not just with communities of faith, but it's one of the places where I see it particularly. People just think, and I think it's also what you were talking about, Alicia, like they just expect, particularly in the Christian faith, that people should be talking about this already. And so it's like, let me just give you the talking points since that we should already be talking about this. And I mean, that's something that we do in this work with anyone that we come into contact. What do you mean this isn't the most important issue? It is for me. It's what I do all the time. So why isn't it for you? So that we have to get over that and have to start with asking questions about what people's experience is and how they're dealing with it and what they're seeing and get to a point of common language before we can start developing talking points and that it's part of the community, right? It's a part of the community. It's not, which I know I do, but it's not that community. It's a part of our community that we are not in right now, right? At this particular center or that agency.
totally agree with Bill about partnership. I partner with churches all the time, and you're right, they help me with shoes, clothing, poverty. They help me with, I can send a family to a food bank every Wednesday or Tuesday to a different church. And the families really appreciate that stuff. And I think the church gives back in that. It's just like you were saying, having that partnership and building on it, so you have more things happening. I mean, feeding with the body, feeding with the soul as well, though, type of thing. So I think there's a lot of room to grow. Even with me, I mean, I shouldn't say all churches give me clothing and donations. They do a lot for me. And they probably say, well, you don't need nothing for us. But I need to really sit down and have a conversation with people I work with and say, you're really doing this for me. You're really helping me end violence because now this family has clothing. We're providing food for this family, and as soon as we're going to take him stuff, he had robbed food from his work. And they had fired him, and we're like, oh, I'm not bringing food, because of his church, though, that would, missed it, but all that stuff is prevented because they help in these different things. Because poverty does lead to violence. And we all know it. I mean, if you're poor and you're hungry, you're going to do something about it. So I think church is for, I have a meeting with the pastor hopefully next week, and we're going to talk about how they can help, our families out. And it's really just growing myself as thinking, wow, they're really helping me out more than just pants, shoes, and food. It's a lot of stuff. So it would be nice to partner more and say, you know what, I could be at churches too to talk about XYZ. I've never really offered myself to go. So maybe having that dialogue, like you said, flip the script, I've never flipped the script, so maybe I should ask them what they need from me. And I'm always asking churches what I can get from them. So, thank you for that.
And sometimes finding not even what you need from me
What can we do
What's
together?
going on?
What's happening?
what's happening. Let me get to know you very much. You don't do that much. So that it's not all based on transactions. Not even based on relationship.
I think there's a lot of work going on in the faith-based community grappling with issues like gender inequality. That, it's funny because I don't think about it on a regular basis, but just sitting here, I can think of different churches in different contexts that are doing the work in terms of women in power or lack of power of women, and all of this work that we're not familiar with because we're not there, we're not doing the work with them. We assume that we are the experts and we're coming in, and so it's just interesting. I think about just all of that is going on in the faith community. We're just not a part of the conversation, right? I think about the Pope and what's going on in the Vatican right now and grappling with issues of homophobia and all of these things that are going, whether or not we think they're going far enough is another question, but they're grappling with these issues and we're not a part of the conversation.
Yeah, I was going to say that, just to talk a little bit about your question regarding, can TAASA, create these curriculum. I agree with Emiliano in that, the communities know their communities better and we have those contacts and, and when I say we, I'm talking about advocates and prevention workers, to be able to help in some way, to get the training that they need and offer the support, so on and so forth. But I also want to acknowledge that not every place in Texas has prevention workers who have the time to go, because they're also answering the hotline and they're also doing counseling and they're also running the shelter. So I agree with you that it's going to take some support maybe from the state coalition or from other prevention workers who do have the grants to build this curriculum and to do the training. One of the things that I'd really like to see happen, which is a conversation that we had ad hoc years and years ago, is the idea based on a man named Paulo Freire, who wrote a few books, but Pedagogy of the Oppressed, in where we kind of term it in train the trainer now, right? So you go, you might be in a community and support them in the work that they want to do, including like, let's say, sexual violence prevention, and then letting them run it, like letting them do it, because there aren't enough of us. There really aren't, because even for the three of us, there's so many survivors that we can't go out and do all this wonderful prevention work that we want to do. Or like for me, I'm not involved in a church specifically right now. And yes, I can always do more, but I tend to do more about serving the waiting list that we have. We have 24 sexual assault survivors waiting to get counseling right now. So there's a lot of work. There's a lot of us who have the passion, but I hope that we get to that point where we can go in communities and offer them support. Because I come from that community. If I learned it and I have the passion, there's somebody else there waiting with all this potential to be another Emiliano or JJ.
Well, the type of church that I go to is, it's not the traditional Catholic in that kind of stuff. But the one I go to, and here honestly, they have, I'm part of the production team where we, every single child goes and watches our production. And we purchase our production from a company online that has skits and everything. And our show is probably 20 minutes long. We have a message that we carry. And those companies that are out there, there's tons of them. You can pick out which story you want to present if you're these types of churches that do the modern with the technology and everything else. And you can put your message across, and it's all, we just push buttons. And then we have kids that actually come in early, read the script, go over the script, and we have the lights and everything going on. It's really great. It was very kid-oriented as a go through first lessons, and the kids perform. Some of them are teens and everything. So our church is actively carrying the issues that are underneath, and morals and concerns and stuff. But I'm just saying that's out there, and would be nice if like TAASA had one that's really specific for all these churches that are moving like that in that direction. And that's under one of those companies that provide scripts.
I think that's a wonderful idea. The more creative you are, and the more technology-based we are nowadays with young people, the better. And I would say there's probably something out there. Maybe TAASA didn't create it, but nationally there must be that kind of message that you're looking for already. And I think that's kind of the work that Emiliano can do is research for you.
Yeah, I think I will start this piece because we want to make sure the wrap is that people have to get back on the road and we have the rest of the day, and of course our weekend to enjoy. But I think one of my next steps is to compile resources related to these three faiths. One of the things that we did not do was come up or provide you with sort of any tangible resources around whether they're web-based or whether they're publications or research around this particular issue. So if you have encountered materials related to this issue, please share them with us, include them in the hashtag, and we will sort of try to compile some resources and share that out with the attendees of the summit. I think sort of one of our next steps clearly is looking at ways of compiling and supporting these efforts and continuing this conversation. Not just the task force advisory committee really sort of looking at this after we sort of had time to reflect about the summit and really think about how do we move this forward over the next week. So that's my next step. Let me go this way real quick. We don't want to keep people too long, but just one thing you're going to do as a result of this conversation.
I have a family member who is in a very, this is how I would describe it, a very conservative branch of Presbyterianism. And I'm gonna see if maybe there's a way to create a conversation in his Bible study group, or what does it mean to be respectful, and, what does that mean?
I'm gonna sound like a broken record, but, just for me, my takeaway from this whole day and what I'm gonna go back to is really challenging the language that I use, challenging the way that I talk about the work that I do, and how can I take that to really reach people?
I'm going to go back to my colleagues at the network and find out if we have had any conversation or real good collaboration with the Faith Trust Institute and see what type of interchange we can have or exchange we can have. Because I think this is an area definitely part of faith, whether you want to embrace it or not, is a fundamental part of anyone's cultural identity, whether you were born in it and then left it, because faith does have an insurmountable effect in everything that we do, whether it's in public policy or in our personal lives or in the work that we do as advocates. I'm thinking I'm going to go back and really bring this information to my leadership and where are we at as a network that does focus around advocacy for Latino survivors and families, and just in the overall health of Latino families and communities. Where is the conversation about faith, and how does that lead into ending gender-based violence?
So I have a niece that just graduated from St. Edward's, and her goal in life is to go back and learn theology and get her MSW, and she's really opened my eyes to the role that faith leaders play in providing counseling and therapy, in essence, to their congregants. And so I think that it would be really amazing if TAASA and TCFD came up with some kind of training and preparedness training for those folks that are interested and can get some CEUs, so that whenever they are approached by people in their community around these issues, they do have a response that is somewhat reflective of what we would consider, survivor focus.
It's really true. Pretty much exactly what Felicia said. I've actually been thinking about it some recently, even with the language that I use to talk about the work that I do, doing it long enough that I've definitely got into a rut with the language that I use. Because I've been particularly working at TAASA, you can sit in the office and talk the same language, and it's just more and more and more and more where that doesn't work often. And so this is another reminder of that.
Probably change the way same thing, language. I think I grew up in a faith-based, and I kind of left. And then now I work with them in a whole different way, I think, that something didn't sound, I don't sound too friendly with them, but I'm very grateful for what they do, but I don't even think they know my background with the faith-based. I think you just see me as this person that comes in and writes off the families. I think maybe sitting down and having an honest conversation with them and show them that, there is religion in my world as well. There was, and there is, and there could be.
Personally, I think as my team and I, as we develop education opportunities for professionals around the state, I think this is something we're going to be really mindful of. Thinking about how are we addressing this huge facet of life. We do a lot of work in the fifth realm, battery intervention, prevention, and this needs some attention because this shapes, like we've all identified, this shapes a lot of.
Well, what I'd like to do is volunteer for one of y'all, anybody. I have a 16-year-old son, and I'd like to come into your offices Monday or Tuesday, early Tuesday, so you can ask him this question. Completely available for school without Monday.
Men mentoring men.
Yeah.
This is not the first time you've said it. Guys are used to it.
Thanks, Brian.
On immediately working with the leaders, showing them how important their role is in helping their, their flock, their members.
For me, it's along with what Alicia was saying about the language that we've been using, and really analyzing how that stopped me from recognizing what faith communities have been doing in terms of doing the same work that we're doing, and being able to just acknowledge that and recognize exactly what kind of progress they've made and how we've been absent from that. And when two people are working on the same thing in different places, it's just not very efficient. That's what I'm going to be talking about.
Mentally. But for me, like I've always, there was a study that I read a long time ago, probably, I don't know, someone, another study that says the opposite. But anyway, so the study that I read said that people that have faith, they get out of crises and it's like, kind of like easier. It helps them a lot because it's like right. So to me, I've always tried to find like a balance between my counseling self, like this feedback, and also that part, like drawing that from people. So I just feel like the whole day conversation has helped me, just think again about that, like, and just this is so important in prevention in any aspect of the movement that we want to think about it because it's part of who we are as humans. This is another area that we have, whether like I really think about, like, it's part of our society, part of our communities, and it's a very intimate and private aspect sometimes. So I think it makes a big impact wanting to reach. I just want to keep on thinking about it.
On a similar note for me, being that my work is directly with survivors, I think continuing to understand the role that religion and spirituality play, and part of this is a retraining for me because my educational training taught me that you don't touch it. You don't touch it unless the client brings it up, period. And I think that does a disservice to the client. And so in my professional ongoing training, I do want to be more cognizant, like I said, of the role that it plays to create that space, that safe to explore these issues, but also where I have, as well as can be, suppose, an understanding the different things and ongoing thinking process.
Well, based on the fact that I gave myself a big goal for working with the Islamic community. So that's going to be my big focus, and I'm going to pass along some information to Renee for the Jewish community. And I would like to have a dialogue with Alicia about her comment regarding consent, because I hear it, and I get it, and I want to talk about it more. To just flesh it out. Since you're going to be thinking about language, I want to hear what you come up with, and we can dialogue.
I just like wanted to talk about like understanding people's boundaries. And that's kind of one thing that I was thinking that too, like how do you reframe consent? So talking about boundaries, that's what you do for little kids, like my right arm to me, these boundaries.
So we want to continue to facilitate this dialogue, especially if, on our prevention news page, and for the folks that are on that, or online, continue using Metafaith Texas, and to continue to share your thoughts and your insights about today's topic. But this is absolutely just the beginning of, I think, an important conversation that we hope to continue at our state conference this year. And so we hope that all of you will be able to join us for that. To be part of that and be part of the prevention conversations that will happen there and network with folks from around the state that are doing some of the work with survivors and victims and prevention educators. So we hope that you will all join us for that. And I also want to thank you on behalf of TAASA for joining us today for the Meditate Summit. I want to encourage you to contact us here at TAASA if we can be of any assistance or help you think about these issues and sort of explore them more. And so again, my contact information is there, and please follow me on Twitter if you're not already, just for updates and information about task force and about engaging for women. So yeah, thank you so much. We wish you safe travels for those folks who are traveling home. And thank you all so much for joining us. And when the recordings become available, please share them with the folks in your community. If you just take a few minutes, complete your evaluation, leave those for us. We really appreciate it. And we hope that you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you for joining us for the Men's Day Summit. The evaluation happening is going to
There's extra company.